We have an excellent guest here, Jenn Smith. Now, in terms of the documentation, this is not something that I'm posting on Facebook, okay? This is documentation just for the project. Because this is a funded project, and if this ever sees the light of day, so to speak, we've got everybody's name and we'll ask everybody for a release, but you don't have to worry about that right now, okay? Without further ado, I'd like to turn the proceedings over to our guest. And you say trans activist or anything like that? Do you have a title?
I'm a writer, I'm a public speaker, I'm a political activist.
You left out trouble, because trouble is your...
I am trouble. Yes, lots of evidence of that.
Excellent. Well, I turn the floor over to you. Tell us how it is.
Okay, all right. Well, I thank everybody for coming tonight. I hope you'll find my little speech valuable and informative, and hopefully it will generate some interesting discussion when I'm done. So I'm going to cut to the chase. Some of you may have, before coming tonight, taken time to familiarize yourselves with who I am and what I represent. Some of you may have known who I was before this was even planned. What I would say is, if you got your information regarding me from the mainstream media, what you undoubtedly acquired was an extraordinarily distorted and dishonest representation of who I am. And this would be across the board, no matter what media source that you looked at. And this fact is going to be central in the thesis that I'm presenting tonight, but I'll return to that. So just to give you an example, if I were to describe myself politically, I don't like to describe myself politically because I believe that the whole political establishment is corrupt, so I don't have a whole lot of faith in politics. But if I was forced to describe myself, I would describe myself as a left-leaning libertarian. Okay, I'm also transgender. If you were to read the many media stories and reports about me, if you were to listen to my critics, you would quite possibly come to the conclusion that I am an alt-right-wing white supremacist bigot. Okay. So it is so far from the truth of who I am and what I represent. And again, that is something that I'm going to be addressing here. So the main question that we're going to be looking at tonight is related to this whole digital media craze and social media, and how, what I would say is, somebody who was previously nobody. Okay, so I was living in complete obscurity. Nobody knew anything about me. But the question is, how did somebody in my situation that was unknown get into a situation that we're in today, where at this point countless newspaper articles and many radio and television stories have at least mentioned me or focused on what I talk about? How did we get to this place? And I would suggest to you that the fact that I was able to rise from obscurity and to become somebody that the establishment at least had to deal with on a very important and central issue in politics right now points to something much larger and very important. I would argue that what you're going to hear tonight and what we're going to discuss tonight may be one of the most important discussions you have ever heard in terms of the evolution of democracy and defending freedom in Canada. I know that sounds like a strong claim, but I hope in the body of my little talk here to be able to support that. But as I do in my public talks, I would like to start by citing Voltaire. Voltaire said that whenever you enter a debate or whenever you enter a discussion, the most important thing you can do is begin by defining your terms. That makes sure that we are all speaking the same language, and not only that we have the same understanding of words, but we understand why words are being used in that way. So there are some words that we need to put our attention on immediately in order to try to understand who I am and what I represent. So we'll start with what has quite surprisingly become what I would argue is the most contentious word in this whole debate, and that's the word woman. Now, I would say that it should be surprising to everybody that this has become a subject of contention. So if I had sat in a room like this 30 years ago and I had made the statement that a man is not a woman, there would have been some confused looks in the room, and then somebody would have said something like, well, thank you, Captain Obvious. What's your point? However, we have now entered a state where if I make that statement, I can be accused of bigotry and hatred. Now, what has happened is the language has actually been changed. So what they're doing now is they're saying, so a lot of especially the recent media reports about me will accuse me, and they will say, well, Smith is known to say that transgender women are men, like this is some sort of accusation. What I would say is that we need to start with understanding how I interpret the word woman. So I interpret the word woman in the way it has been interpreted throughout I would say, the majority of human history, as long as that word has been in use. Woman, I would say, is a word that is informed by reality. So for instance, if we were in a nudist camp, and I were to say to you, okay, I want you to go into this nudist camp, and without talking to anybody, without any sort of dialogue, I want you to separate the men from the women. What would happen is you would go in there and you would quite accurately create two separate camps, okay? And those camps would be separated based on easily discernible characteristics, okay? So the camp that you put to one side as a woman, that is how I understand and interpret the word woman, okay? And this, like I said before, has been the interpretation of woman for a very long time. Now, what they have done now is that they have said that trans women are women, but I don't see it that way. So 98.2% of trans women, most people are unaware of this fact, but 98.2% of trans women have their male genitalia still intact, much like I do. So I would say that just like myself, trans women are actually men. So when I'm saying that men are men, there's nothing controversial there, okay? What's happened is we've gotten into an obfuscation of our language where terms are being confused. So that's what we start with, is an understanding of woman. So when I say that a man, a trans woman who is a man, is not a woman, I don't think that that's controversial, and I don't say it to be disrespectful, and I don't say it to be hateful. I say it because it's important. So for instance, all of the laws and programs that we have created over the years designed to protect and enable women were based on this understanding of the interpretation of the word woman. If we allow this classic interpretation of the word woman to be destroyed, we are going to destroy the intention of all the laws and programs that were designed to protect them and enable them. And this is exactly what we are seeing in society today. Now that, like if you take a look around, you'll see that we're actually putting men into women's prisons. We have men going into women's rape shelters. We have men taking part in women's sports and all of these types of things. And this is what happens when you destroy the meaning of an important word like woman. So when I say these things, I don't say it to be mean. I don't say it to be disrespectful. I say it because it's important, and we need to get our society back to what I would call physical reality. Now, the question is, how did we get into this state in society where me making this statement is now considered unorthodox and, in some cases regarded as hatred? How did we get here? I would say that we got here because we have conflated the two words sex and gender. So we need to understand that those two words are separate words for a reason, and they refer to separate things. So sex is a biological reference, okay? So sex is basically coded in every cell of your body. You're either XX or you're XY, so you're either male or you're female. With very rare exceptions, and a lot of people like to bring in the question of intersex into this debate, but intersex is not a realistic part of this debate. So that's sex. It's coded in your body. It cannot be changed. It's never been changed in human history. Whether, doesn't matter what type of drugs you take, what kind of surgery you have, you cannot change sex. Gender, on the other hand, is a mind reference, basically. Gender refers to social rules and expectations, forms of dress, these types of things. That is gender. So gender is a set of expectation that is placed upon a sex in a society. It's not the sex itself. And I had a discussion earlier about the whole, whether there's only two genders or not. I would say that trying to isolate gender in that way is an incorrect way of looking at it, because gender is the mind, and if you look at the history of gender roles, etc., you'll find that they change over time and they change from place to place. So I would say that gender is actually fluid. Sex, on the other hand, is not. But what we have happening now in society, and most concerningly in our schoolrooms right now, in classrooms, is a conflation of these two terms. And so now we have men identifying as women because of this conflation of the terms. So transgender, I am transgender. So for me, transgender, well, in LGBTQ parlance, transgender is an umbrella term that has underneath it all kinds of different identities. But for me, transgender is a way of interacting and expressing in the world. It is not a way for me to change sex. I never used to care about things like pronouns until I got into this debate. And that leads me to my next subject, which I take, again, a lot of heat for, and that is pronoun usage. So, for instance, I will be demonized in some cases because of my dealings with Morgane Auger, who is the vice president of the New Democratic Party here in British Columbia, and like myself is transgender. But when I'm in debates with Auger, when he chooses to engage me, I have frequently referred to Morgane, who identifies as not only a woman, but as the mother of two. I have used him and he when talking about Morgane Auger, and people have said to me that this is an extraordinary act of disrespect, and that makes me a hater and bully and all these things. But again, just like the word woman, I don't use pronouns that way to be mean or disrespectful. I do it because it's important. So one of the first things I discovered when I entered this debate going on, well, it's 2-3 years ago now, one of the first things I discovered when I was engaging, particularly in online debates and social media with the other side, is that because we had so many males who were using names like Mary and Julie or Jenn, it became sort of impossible for me to know whether I was talking to a man or a woman. And sometimes that is sort of relevant to the discussion. Now, we've always sort of had names like that, like Chris or Pat, or these names where you're not sure, okay, are you talking about a man or a woman? In the past, you could ask, right? Now it's becoming almost verboten, forbidden to ask the question whether or not somebody is really a man or a woman. Okay, my cat's throwing me off. And I've got the phone. Take a sip here.
It was the pronouns.
Okay, so pronouns. Okay, so in these conversations, it became hard for me to distinguish the men from the women. So the other way that we are in language able to distinguish between males and females is with pronouns. He, her, she, him, these types of things. It allows us to order our language. And when you basically destroy the classic use of these words, not just man and woman, but she, her, and all this stuff, you create linguistic chaos. So I was unable within the course of conversations to be able to distinguish men from women. So at that point I said, okay, you know what? I'm just going to start ordering our language again because this is important. First of all, I don't need to be referred to as a woman. I don't need to be called a she or her. I've been called all sorts of pronouns. I've been called he, him, she, her, ze, zer, all of these different things I've been called. I don't care. It's not necessary. As Boy George said recently, we need to be more than a pronoun. Pronouns serve a very important role in our language for ordering our language. So that's why I'm a stickler for he and him. Plus, I also believe it's part of a game. So Lee Lakeman, who is a well-known feminist in Vancouver, recently talked about pronouns at her talk at the Vancouver Public Library. And when she was asked about pronouns, she says, well, usually I'll respect the pronouns that somebody uses, but on the other hand, I find myself feeling like I'm being asked to submit to the con. And I would agree with her in that regard. The question here is, how did we get to this state where my saying these things, like my wanting an ordered language, which is clear about whether we're talking about males and females, and where I want to say that a male can't be a woman. How did we get to this state now where that is considered unorthodox? Well, we'll look at that. What I believe, and I hope to illustrate, and having analyzed the subtleties of this debate at the sort of the highest levels and the lowest levels of this debate, is I believe that there is a totalitarian undercurrent pushing this. Okay? And I will get into that in a moment. But to sort of frame that and give you an understanding of that, what I'd like to do here is quote one of the greatest scholars on authoritarianism and totalitarianism in the 20th century, Hannah Arendt. In talking about totalitarians, she said, "The most striking difference between ancient and modern sophists is that the ancients were satisfied with a passing victory of the argument at the expense of truth, whereas the moderns want a more lasting victory at the expense of reality. Before totalitarian leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for the facts as such, for in their opinion, fact depends entirely on the power of the man who can fabricate it. Totalitarians are not satisfied with merely lying, but instead deliberately attempt to transform their lies into reality. That is the totalitarian mindset. And as George Orwell noted, the ultimate act of state power is the ability to force the individual to speak something that they know to be false. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? Okay, anybody who's read 1984 knows that the correct answer is not 4. It's 5, and you better learn to answer the correct way, even though you know the actual number of fingers that are being held up. I would say we have the same thing going on with the man is a woman debate. Okay? So you can know that I am a man, but if I say so, you are forced to say that I'm a woman. That is a totalitarian push. Now, to sort of frame why I say that this debate is so important, I need to sort of lay a foundation to understand like what my mindset was when I came into this debate. So when I entered this debate, I came in with a view of the establishment and the mainstream media that I essentially got way back in university from Noam Chomsky and what he called his propaganda model that he wrote about in his now infamous book, Manufacturing Consent. Now, for those who are familiar with Noam, they'll know that he has argued that there are 2 primary methods of control in the mainstream media. The first one, actually, he didn't focus on heavily, but that's a more overt control. So one of the first times I saw Noam Chomsky, there was some media person who went after Noam and says, "How dare you suggest that the media is controlled? How is the media controlled?" And Noam kind of laughed and said, why is it that nobody ever comes to me and asks how General Motors is controlled? They're controlled because they own the corporation. They determine who gets hired. They determine the policies. They determine the direction. They determine what kind of product is going to be put out. So that is like an overt control. So we have seen this in the media before, where editors have basically nixed stories or edited stories or changed stories. So there is that overt control. But that was not what Noam Chomsky believed was the primary method of control in the mainstream media. He believed that the primary method of control began at the hiring process. So what they would do is they would as an editor or whoever's doing the hiring, they would look at potential candidates and they would review their work and see what do they write about, what is their leaning, how do they view the establishment. So on the one hand, you could say that overt control is, that's a strong form of control, but it's way too much work. okay, to be censoring and editing everything all the time. It's much easier to make sure that you're hiring people who already think the same way as you. Okay? So that was the second method of control, and I think that in Chomsky's book, he established a very powerful case to prove essentially this is what is going on. Now, unlike Chomsky, I actually believe that there are three methods of control. The third method Chomsky actually didn't write about, and I would argue that our mainstream media now is far worse than in Chomsky's time. And the reason may be, possibly, because this third method of control has not been discussed, at least not discussed widely. It was discussed briefly by Carl Bernstein, award-winning Washington Post reporter. It was not reported in the Washington Post, however. He published a story in 1977 in Rolling Stone magazine called "The CIA and the Media." And that basically is what I would have called almost a whitewash of the findings of the Church Committee, which was done in the United States and was designed to look at the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency. And one of the findings of the Church Committee was that the CIA essentially admitted to having 400 agents and assets working in the mainstream media back in, I think this was 1975. So 400 agents working in the mainstream media at that time. The editor of the New York Times was approached about Bernstein's article and asked what he thought about it. And he kind of laughed and said, well, I think the numbers are wrong. I think it's probably twice that many. Okay. Now, we've been led to believe that intelligence operations in the media have been rolled way back, and it's not really a big issue anymore. However, what I would say is that if you look at the wake of the 9/11 attacks in the United States, the U.S. created something called the Office of Strategic Influence. That organization was established with the specific purpose of going out into the world and manipulating and spinning information in the media, ostensibly to fight the war on terrorism. Okay? But in this global society, of course, if you're manipulating the media abroad, that's going to come back home at some point. And so that was what was happening, and there was an uproar against the Office of Strategic Influence that got to the desk of the guy who was in charge of it, and that was Donald Rumsfeld. So basically, there was a consensus reached in the government at that time that, okay, we need to get rid of the Office of Strategic Influence because people are too concerned about what's happening with it. And Donald Rumsfeld's response, this interestingly was published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which some people might be familiar with, a really A-class source of things that aren't always discussed in the mainstream media. But in his discussion with the journalist there, he said that when they came to me and said that we had to get rid of this organization, I said to them, okay, what you really want is you want the name. Okay, I will give you the name, all right? So you don't want the Office of Strategic Influence anymore? Okay, say no more. It's gone. No more Office of Strategic Influence. But what I will tell you is that all of the agents and all of the assets and all of the work that these people have been doing will continue to be done. This was not covered in the mainstream media, but it probably should have been, because what Rumsfeld was essentially admitting to at that point was the creation of a nameless organization whose job was to go out into the world and manipulate the public mind through the media. Now, if you understand that the CIA has admitted that they are infiltrating the media and manipulating information, they claim just in foreign countries, you need to sort of roll back and look at things like the Five Eyes Agreement, which is basically an international intelligence agreement between 5 of the largest NATO powers. And basically they have agreed to cooperate amongst themselves on various intelligence projects. And this led Edward Snowden recently to suggest that this organization actually was designed with the intention of subverting local laws regarding intelligence operations. So if we concede, by the CIA's own admission, that they are altering and manipulating information out there, what about all these other intelligence agencies? So what about MI6? What about the Mossad? What about CSIS? The idea that these agencies would not get involved in manipulating the media, I think would be a little naive, okay? So we have this intelligence establishment embedded in the media. And according to the church committee, at that time, they said they could plant any story that they wanted. So they are spinning the media. Okay, so that is sort of a third method of control that I personally have put into Chomsky's propaganda model. But whether whatever the means of control out there, I would say that what I have discovered is that in my own dealings with the media is that there does seem to be some sort of absolute control over the media. And again, I'm going to warn about Chomsky's second method of media control, which is making sure people who think a certain way are there. But in my dealings with the media, for instance, I have been lied about. I've been misrepresented over and over, consistently across the board, from newspaper to radio station, from one company to another, and it's almost like they're in unison. Okay, so there seems to be a control, and Chomsky talked about this, of the media on important issues. And how that control is being affected is up for you to decide, but I would say it is worse than it's ever been in human history. So this is where it gets important. Okay, so I would say that my case, and the fact that I was able to rise to a position where I have been able to inject my voice into an important discussion politically, is illustrative of something much bigger that requires our attention. So when I got into this debate, I came in with that view of the establishment and of the media. I assumed, having surveyed all of the discussion out there and having determined what the official orthodoxy was saying, I knew that saying that a man is not a woman would be resisted by the establishment. And I knew that a lot of the other stuff I was going to be saying would be resisted by the establishment as well. Do we have protesters out there? Okay, so I knew when I entered this debate that I would hit a wall with the mainstream media, and they would try to, I would have to force my way through that somehow. So I didn't expect to get any help from the media, and I didn't. Fortunately, when I entered this debate, I entered at a time when digital media and social media was still relatively free. I would say that the freedom in social media has been eroded significantly since I entered this debate. But at that time, I was able to enter at the level of the internet. Okay, so I expected resistance. So I was able to go into social media, though. So I was, when I entered this debate, initially I didn't plan on being a public speaker. So I just began by writing. I set up my own blog and I began writing essays and stuff, and I made social media accounts, and I started doing interviews with online media sources like Adam has with Freedom Free for All. Fortunately, I wrote an essay called Synanon, the Brainwashing Game in Modern Transgender Activism, which was a bit of a home run and got me a lot of attention. It really went viral, particularly within the community of this debate. And that put me on the map, and it brought an awful lot of people to my social media site. And I was able to work that in order to raise sort of public awareness of what my arguments were and who I was in this debate. I was able to work that extensively. I say that social media was critical in my ability to join this debate at the provincial level at least, but it was more than that. So it was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So I had to stay on it and go after it, and I really had to work social media, and I really had to engage people, and I really had to get out there. So it's more than just social media. But social media clearly played a big role in gaining some of the numbers that I needed to sort of propel me forward and maybe get the mainstream media to pay attention. What I discovered initially is once I started developing sort of a bit of a name for myself, when I was out doing public talks and some of the activism that I was involved in, the initial reaction of the media across the board was to ignore me and pretend I didn't exist. Okay, so we did two protests here in Victoria. The first one we did in Victoria, it was a joint operation basically between the Canadian Christian Lobby, Laurel and Tyler Thompson, and myself. But I was the official media spokesperson for that rally. And when the rally went off, I did talk to quite a few media people outside the rally. But when they actually went to press with their stories, I would say 95% of them didn't even write my name, let alone quote me directly. They pretended I didn't exist. And this happened over and over again. It became a joke on my social media where I was talking to people about these stories that they're being written about events that I was at, where I, in many cases, was the keynote speaker, and yet they weren't mentioning my name even. So it took quite a while for me to punch through that. And the way I punched through that was just to keep on going, keep on working social media, keep on doing interviews, and that was eventually enough to sort of put me over the top and start making some waves. The fact that they sort of ignored me at the first rally informed me for the second rally, which we did 6 months later. So when that rally was planned, I decided that I wanted to force the media to pay attention to me, to actually have to type my name. So it became Jenn Smith's anti-SOGI 123 rally. I was listed in the press releases as the official organizer and the official media contact.
SOGI being?
SOGI 123, so that is the government's educational program that I believe is endangering vulnerable kids. It's teaching all this stuff like boys can be girls. It's ostensibly described as a anti-bullying program, but it's nothing of the sort. So I believe that this program is dangerous, and I give lots of reasons for that in my presentations. And so this rally was basically rallying other people who sort of saw it the same way as me. But in this case, I wanted to force the media to pay attention to me. So my name was everywhere. It was on the name of the event. I was the official organizer. I was the official media spokesman. When I talked to the media at that event, once again, probably it was a little better. But I would say probably still 70% of the people who wrote about me didn't quote me or didn't mention my name at all. Okay? But again, sticking to it, I was able to get that changed in time. But you can see this is what I was fighting against. To conclude, or to underscore what we're getting at here, I think, and to understand the importance of what I'm talking about here tonight, in terms of social media and digital media, this is an extraordinarily important issue. I want you to imagine for a second, if you were to take digital media and social media out of the equation, what would have I been facing? I would have been facing a wall of hostile media, and it would have been virtually impossible for me to inject myself into this discussion had social media and digital media not been present. It was the presence of social media and digital media that allowed a nobody to come up and come into the spotlight and actually interject a different narrative that was contrary to the prevailing orthodoxy. So what I would say is that the details of my case aren't so important as what my case tells us about the value and the power of digital media and social media. I would argue that the appearance of social media on the social landscape is probably the greatest democratization and freedom tool in the history of humankind. Because what it is doing is it is taking absolute power away from the establishment who currently control the mainstream media and is turning it over to the people. And this is why I would argue we now see an almost universal push across the Western world to censor social media. They understand what happened in cases like me, not just me, but other cases like me. People who would have never had a voice, never been able to organize, never been able to make even a ripple, now have the power to inject themselves into the conversation. And the mainstream establishment doesn't like that, and that's why we're seeing all of these different committees and proposals being put out to censor social media. So back in November, we have the Democracy Under Threat Committee, which went virtually unreported in the mainstream media, and had no less a figure as Maxime Bernier on it, man of the people and Captain Freedom there. But the recommendations of the Democracy Under Threat Committee were that social media, the government needs to work with social media to censor things like hate speech, fake news, and extremism on social media. Okay, now those are all three terms that are very subjective. Okay, who gets to determine what those things are? If we look at what happened with me in the case of Twitter, it should be very instructive to you. So I was, and before I say that, what I should say is that one political analyst in the United States, talking about Twitter, said that Twitter has become a super powerful political tool. If you are a politician and you don't have a Twitter presence, you're dead in the water. This is a powerful political tool. I am a political activist. I had my Twitter account permanently suspended. And what was the reason? What was the justification for suspending my account? Because I said, and I've got a screenshot of this, I said that I will never refer to a male as a woman. And that was deemed hate speech, and so serious that my Twitter account was permanently suspended. So my opposition in this debate, Morgan Auger, continues to use that medium to spread his message. I, who bring an alternative message that is against the orthodoxy, have been silenced. And I would say this is because we have a trend in the establishment right now to gain control of this powerful new form of media that they don't control and they want control. I believe we are at a critical juncture in history. This is a valuable tool for the average person, and it needs to be protected. Instead of all of these, like I'm going to say that it is, and there is value, and it's probably necessary at this stage to regulate social media because it is a powerful political tool, right? We regulate radio, we regulate newspapers and all of this type of stuff. So yes, it should be regulated, but it should be regulated in the direction of democracy and freedom, and not towards censorship, which is what they are doing. So I believe it is incumbent and important upon everybody who has a hope for the evolution of democracy and freedom to stand up and say no to social media censorship and get on this now, because we're in a very narrow window of opportunity right now. They're working to lock down this form of media, and I think it's very serious. And that's all I have to say. So.